Good afternoon, everyone. All right, I love it. I even hear the hecklers starting already over here. Again, welcome to the Cyberspace Future Multi-Domain Challenge Perspective. Today we have a pretty austere panel that is going to talk to us about the dynamic and changing environment that we're facing with cyber, especially in the face of multi-domain. I think everybody knows we're seeing our adversaries really weaponize information and information flow. And we're going to be asking this panel of experts to share a little of their thoughts, their perspectives, what they've done in the past. But first, let's start with the introductions. To my immediate left, please welcome General Kenneth Frank McKenzie, USMC retired. General McKenzie is the former commander of U.S. Central Command. Upon graduation in 1979 from the Citadel, he was commissioned into the Marine Corps and was trained as an infantry officer. General McKenzie became the executive director of the University of South Florida's Global and National Security Institute in May of 22. In July of 2022, he also became the executive director of the Florida Center for Cybersecurity, also known as Cyber Florida. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome General McKenzie. Next, we have Lieutenant General Maria Barrett. Maria Barrett serves as the commanding general of Army Cyber Command for those that have been locked in a closet for a while. You okay? Cyber Command, our cyber, operates and defends our networks and delivers cyberspace effects against our adversaries to defend this nation. Our cyber is engaged in a real-world cyber fight today against near-peer adversaries and a global cyber threat. They defend the military networks, secure network weapon platforms, and protect critical infrastructure. In my opinion, one of the hardest jobs in the Army. Lieutenant General has commanded the 160th Signal Brigade, 3rd U.S. Army, and Commander U.S. Army NETCOM, the position she held prior to coming to our cyber. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Lieutenant General Maria Barrett. Finally, we have Lieutenant General retired Ed Cardone. Ed Cardone's service to the nation spans over 36 years and the former commanding general for the U.S. Cyber Command. He transformed and scaled into a world-class cyber force, which simultaneously standing up a new cyber organization to meet the demands of this contested environment against ISIS. Today, General Cardone is the founding partner and CEO of Touchstone Futures, chairman and senior counselor for several other companies, and a professor of practice at the Applied Research Lab for Intelligence and Security, ARLIS, at the University of Maryland. One thing I would correct on my notes, it says 36 years of service. I would argue he has never stopped serving this country. So please welcome Lieutenant General Ed Cardone. Okay, and finally, and least, is me. I'm Brad Thomason. I'm the director of the Threat Systems Management Office. I have got the privilege and honor of being today's moderator, and I want to thank Chad Bates. Chad has put a lot of this information, he's put a lot of hard time and work together. He's even put notes together so I don't look like a stupid country boy from Alabama. Okay, so I know that's hard, but I appreciate it, Chad, and thank you for the opportunity. Okay, I'm going to start with asking our austere panel to give us a few opening comments. So before we go to the questions, I'm going to start with General McKenzie, sir, and allow you some time to give us some opening comments. Sir, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, and I'm delighted to be here. This is an important conference, and happy to come over from Tampa and spend a little time with you this afternoon. My perspective is the perspective of a theater commander, a combatant commander. Combatant commanders are consumers. We take the product and we use it, whether it's aircraft carriers, cyber, information operations. I'm not interested in training it. I'm not interested in generating it. I'm interested in employing it. So that's the perspective that I bring that's the perspective that I bring here this afternoon. So as a consumer of the product, and particularly cyber, and I'll talk a little more about cyber than anything else in my opening comments, I spent a lot of time when I was the commander looking at offense and defensive cyber. And as you look at it, the lines between kinetic and non-kinetic applications actually blur. And so at any time at Central Command, we held probably 30 war plans against a variety of adversaries. And certainly, I found that cyber had to be so deeply embedded in those plans that you have to consider it at the very beginning. If you start planning and then you think about cyber or cyber effects or information operations halfway through the planning process, it's a disaster. You can't do that. And I think at Central Command, we were pretty good at knowing and understanding that. And on that same subject, I would say that cyber and space, we talk about as the two new domains. Not really new, but the two domains that we're putting a lot of emphasis on right now. From where I sit as a combatant commander, and I believe that even now, the cyber domain is actually more challenging and complex than the space domain. We can map the topology of space pretty well. We understand astrophysics. We know how to look at things in space. I am not yet convinced that we fully mapped the reaches of the net and what cyber does. It's as infinite as the human mind. And so I believe that's an important distinction. Sometimes it's not always well understood. And just like we have very good actual policies for operations in space, our policies for operations in cyber are muddled, confused, and often contradictory. And so we're still exploring that space. So actually, out at least through Sizzler Space, we know space. We don't know cyber, and that's something I think to think about. The last point I'll make is this. When I was the commander of CENTCOM, about every 3 months I'd go to Fort Meade and spend a day with General Nakasone, and would talk about what was going on in my theater, talk about what was going on across the world, and talk about offensive and defensive capabilities. And every time when I left at the end of the day, my knees would be shaking. I'd get in the vehicle, and first thing I'd want to do is throw my cell phone out of the vehicle. And the second thing I'd tell I never want to be in a room with an unclassified computer again. And I say that because our capabilities are remarkable. What we can do is, as Arthur C. Clarke once said, any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic, and we're at that level. On the other hand, we are also by far the most vulnerable nation in the world to cyber attack. We're like a fighter with a powerful right and a glass jaw, and that causes tension in the way that we approach these problems. So I just think it's a vast, challenging field. I'm glad to see that you're here thinking about it, and I'm happy to contribute a little more this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. Next, we'd like to hear from General Barrett. Ma'am.
So I know the title of the panel is Cyber and Multi-Domain Operations, but I'm not going to be restricted to cyber. I'll talk about operations and capabilities in the information environment, generally speaking. As the CG of Army Cyber, we deliver 5 capabilities: operate our networks, defend those networks, attack networks, perform influence operations, and also inform about what it is that we're seeing in the information environment. We do this with our organizations that are assigned to Cyber Command, the Cyber Mission Forces, all the way to expeditionary CEMA teams that we have that combine EW, tool developers, and cyber operators all in one in order to offer options for commanders at a core echelon. We provide support, and I swear we did not synchronize our comments. General McKenzie couldn't have said it better. We support and deliver capabilities to 3 combatant commands, but also to the Army theater commanders as well. So I say all of this to tell you that I look at multi-domain operations through I look at it through 2 different lenses. One, I am always looking at this through global operations. Because of the types of effects that we're talking about, they know no boundaries to a particular theater, especially when we're talking about cyber effects. There might be a way of, as a combatant commander, you're going to be supremely focused in on your theater. However, there might be something that is happening in CONUS that will inevitably affect then General McKenzie's ability to provide operations in the CENTCOM theater. So there's this global piece of it. The second lens that I always look through is the spectrum of conflict, and that is competition, crisis, and kinetic conflict. And Those things are not necessarily sequential. We spend a lot of time on the competition side of the house. And like General McKenzie said, that is where a lot of the work in the information environment needs to occur up front. Because if you're then doing the planning for it in crisis or in conflict, you're behind the power curve there. This really does demand that leaders at the operational level really begin to hone their skills in terms of how to integrate these types of capabilities into their operations, because it's different at each one of those phases: competition, crisis, and conflict. This is where I also think it's very appropriate for this conference to be looking at the pieces of modeling and sim and training, and how can we train at echelon for these types of capabilities that we can't necessarily always take out to a range and train on. And so, again, this is my perspective on the approach to multi-domain operations.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you. And finally, General Cardone.
Thank you, and it's great to be here. It's the first time I've been to this conference, and I have regrets I haven't been here before. So, building on what was already said, as I think about multi-domain, General McKenzie talked about the ability to integrate across these domains a little bit, as did General Barrett. Speed is also really important here, driven by the information domain. So when you think about the need to integrate and the speed at which this has to be done, what's sitting out here, all these capabilities on this floor become critically important, because for cyber in particular, it's the ability to create environments in which we can actually see how all of this is going to work together. When you look at the simulations that are out there on air, land, and sea, we've been doing that for a number of decades. When you look at what's being done in cyber, at least for the Department of Defense, that's still fairly new. Now, what we have to add into that, in my opinion, is electronic warfare, which still is a raging debate over the electromagnetic spectrum and who owns it and how does this fit in. And that'll get resolved. We don't have to resolve it in the manuals. We all know that's a factor. And then the other one is the information that rides on the cyber, on the information networks, and that's everything to do about information or information operations, influence operations, et cetera. So when you put those three things together and think about how are we going to man, train, and equip against that, well, the way that we created decision advantage or competitive advantage in our warfighting skills is our ability to train. And that is a lot about what this conference is about. And so, building on General Barrett's comment on the importance of cyber ranges that can be more inclusive into the other domains is critical, because you can't treat it as separate. If you treat it as separate, what happens then is it's separate. And then we won't really have it the way we want it in competition, crisis, and war. The second piece is right now we don't replicate this well. And what I mean by this is there's too much white carding. And there's a lot of reasons why that happens. But the way I look at things, that's past. What's future? And there's a lot of capability I saw on this floor out here that we got to figure out how to get into all the services and higher levels, because it will also start to tackle the challenge that we have with authorities, which has also been a big problem in this space, that most senior leaders spend significant amounts of time on trying to get authorization to do what might be possible within the values and the ethics that the United States represents. And so I'm really looking forward to the questions, and thanks again for the invitation.
All right, thank you, sir. All right, well, we're going to not disappoint. We're going to move right into some of the questions, okay? The first one I want to start off with is really around some of the current conflicts. I know everybody here watches the news, and I'm going to start with General McKenzie. And, sir, from your time as U.S. CENTCOM commander, as we're watching the news and watching what is unfolding in Gaza, can you give us your observations and thoughts about what we're seeing?
Sure. So I think everyone here recognizes that Hamas achieved tactical and strategic surprise. And they did that by stepping outside the intellectual model that Israel was using to look at them. Israel was used to having significant advantage in the electromagnetic space and their ability to suck signals out of the air, listen to what Hamas is talking about, and also in cyber. So Hamas chose to essentially go cold with that, and by ruthless compartmentation, they were able to preserve the secrecy of their attack. They also preserved it from Lebanese Hezbollah and I believe the Iranians. That's just my opinion. I don't know that anymore, but I would guess that to be the case. So what you see there is an adversary, a very smart adversary, using leverage to overcome a technological advantage that the opponent has. And I think we're going to be studying that for a long time. And the other element that goes in there, always in things like this, is, you know, if you don't believe that your opponent's going to do something, then you tend to filter all intelligence with that confirmation bias. I've been guilty of that. I've seen it happen to ourselves. And I believe in this case, the Israelis went back and did the same thing they did in the fall of 1973. They didn't want to believe that Anwar Sadat was going to cross the Suez Canal. So when the intelligence was there, they chose not to believe it. As the Israelis go back and examine how 7 October happened in this year, they're going to find that the intelligence was there, and they chose not to listen to it, because there's always something there as you go forward. So I think that's a remarkable thing that's worth a lot of further study. The other thing is in the information space. Just think about this. The Hamas attack occurred on 7 October. It was a bloody, violent attack that violated the rules of war and a lot of other things. But it was a discrete event that was over in 48 hours. And so now every day that goes forward, Israel is increasingly competing in an information environment where their attacks are now the subject of world attention. And Hamas's attacks are a day further in the background every day that we go forward. That's a difficult information environment to be in. And the final point I'd say on information operations, and I draw a larger point about the way the United States approaches it, we are always determined in information operations to have an essential relationship with the truth. We're going to be very careful, very, very, very careful when we conduct information operations that ultimately aren't founded on the truth. Our adversaries, and I would include Russia, I would include Hamas, I would include all of our adversaries in the Middle East, have no essential relationship with the truth. They don't need to actually have a sense that what they're saying in some way is related to what actually happened. And that's a new space to be in for us. For most of my career, we thought about the event, whatever the event was the important thing, an attack, a defense, a success, a failure, and then you talk in information operations about that event. Well, now the event doesn't even have to occur. In fact, the event, for vast parts of the people that get their information, the event is actually irrelevant. And we have not come to terms with how to grapple with that in the information space. We're slow to, General Cardone talked about it just a minute ago, we are slow to get approvals. We are slow to understand what our message is. It requires significant coordination. And in fact, it is an industrial age process that's a generation behind the actual challenge that we face. I would like to tell you we're getting better at it. My experience is we're not. We're not getting any better at it at all. And that's why we're often roundly defeated in this space. And I certainly had my share of times in Central Command when an event happened that I wanted to get something out and I couldn't because I had to get approval. And that involves the interagency and that involves time. And time is life in the information environment. So, long answer to a very good question. I think the jury is still out on the way this is going to go forward. But information operations are going to predominate and actually probably determine the outcome of this conflict going forward. Thank you.
Oh, excellent answers. And I want to stay on this for a minute. Let's stay on the current conflicts. I wanted to turn to General Barrett. It's very similar, okay, in that as the Army Cyber Commander, you know, what observations have you made about Ukraine, and how is that driving your thinking of how we fight now and how we prepare for future conflicts?
So probably 3 big observations on Ukraine. There are plenty that can be made, but I'll stick to 3. 1, what you do in competition matters. So if you're going to take Ukraine from the time post-2014 Crimea and all the activities that were done afterwards, an incredible amount of investment in cybersecurity, partnerships with industry partners like Microsoft and Google and probably others, a significant amount of partnership going on with NATO and the U.S. Specifically, Cybercom's hunt forward operations for multiple years prior to the invasion, advising the Ukrainians on what was happening in their networks and allowing them to build resiliency of their networks. All of that combined to repel probably what was a significant onslaught, an unprecedented use of destructive cyber operations against the Ukraine by the Russians in the pre-conflict stage. And so while we can talk about whether or not these things make a difference, had those things not occurred over time and built upon it during the competition phase, I'm going to tell you that the situation in the Ukraine probably would have been much worse. The second big observation that I would give you is, and this is something that we need to take to heart, the fact that we are going to be operating in a comms-degraded environment. So whether we're talking about the electromagnetic spectrum or maybe attacks on SICR that might cause telecommunications or power to go down, I think this is something that commanders at all levels need to be planning for. It's not just sufficient to have a PACE plan, your primary, alternate, contingency, emergency communications that every warfighter knows that they've got to default to as each one goes down. But you've got to understand the weaknesses of the next thing that you're going to, because hurting will occur. The adversary will take out one form of communication in order to make you use something that is either less secure or more noticeable in the electronic magnetic spectrum. And so we need to really practice that in our exercises and not bypass that as General Cardone said, a white card. And then the third thing I would say is just the incredible transparency of the battlefield itself. Whether we're talking about the usage of drones, and this is really on both sides, whether it was about the democratization of information, people with smartphones and the ability to use applications to communicate very easily what they were seeing on the battlefield, to communicate BDA. That aspect of the battlefield, I think, is something that we have not, we as a U.S. forces have not really experienced. And that's what I would, we've got to prepare for that one as well.
Okay, thank you. One more. We're going to stay on this, but I want to get a little bit more historical perspective. So, General Cardone, you led Army Cyber and information operations during the height of the global war on terror. Can you speak a little bit to the increase of information activities during the competition phase and their impact? I see them growing more and more in line with what General Barrett, General McKenzie have talked about. So can you elaborate and talk a little bit about your perspective?
Yes, and so many of my perspectives on this came in 2016 when I stood up what's now called Task Force Ares. At the time, it was actually a classified task force, offensive cyber task force against ISIS, but a lot of the operations that we were looking to do were actually in the information domain, and the biggest problem there was authorities, by far. And what do I mean by this? So I'll give you a few examples. So it's hard to believe back then that one of the big problems we were having is the recruitment of American youth into ISIS. And what was going on there is they're using our social media platforms, American social media platforms, to do this. And at the time, those companies saw themselves as global companies. So they were unwilling to do anything about this at the time. And so then it starts to bring up questions like this. Can you hack Facebook? And they're like, oh, it's an American company. Right. But the mission is to stop recruiting American youth. So you can't have it both ways. Something has to give here. And this is what I talk about on some of this information challenges that we were having in the competitive space. So this, to me, a couple of things. One, it's a lot better now than it was in 2016. It's not where it needs to be. That's the first big one. The second one is we don't play this very well except in the real world. In other words, we don't have the simulations that are of enough rigor, fidelity, et cetera, that cause the kind of questions in advance that prevent speed, integration when we actually need it. So, General McKinsey talked about, things happen. It takes days, weeks, sometimes months to get approval to do stuff. When you think about it, it's because they're not exposed. And I say they, not like the mythical they. There's an entire approval process for this, so there's a way to do that. So I believe the way to go after this, and I want to, before I forget this part, General Barrett talked about the electromagnetic spectrum. So for me, one of the things that's really evolved is this electronic warfare. And you see this in spades, right, in the Ukraine. So this is a lot to me like radars. Like, it's not like a giant blanket that sits down and you have this cone of, signal death, right? Power, direction. There's all kinds of things that can be done inside the electromagnetic spectrum that we can still operate. May not be the way we want to, but it can still be done. But we're not really working on that in the competition phase. We might want to actually build a number of things to be ready for something, for example, in certain theaters, if we had the right kind of simulations that could show for this investment, this would enable this kind of capability. My last comment is the way I believe that you have to approach competition is a campaign approach. So often we're very reactive. Something happens, what can you do? What are all the capabilities that we have? And we have strategic guidance that sits over here. But to operate in the cyber domain, sorry about my mic here, to operate in the cyber domain, time is important. Access is, I'll just start with that. Authorities, do you have the people trained? Are we operating in networks that we often talk about Huawei networks, not in the US. Yeah, but a lot of the world's using Huawei networks, right? So do we have that played? So it's this idea of if you have a campaign approach with, not for the sake of cyber, but what's the primary effect you're looking for? What's the secondary effect you're looking for? And what I like to describe as the second order effect, which are cascading effects, which, to me is the holy grail in cyber. So if we think about campaigns in competition, I think we'd have a very different way of looking at this. And when I say campaigns, it's not solely cyber, it's cyber, EW, and information.
Okay, before we get off the subject, I know a lot of times me listening, I always generate questions or other thoughts. I wanted to offer it back to our other panelists if there's any additional thoughts you had before I move on. It's up to y'all.
The only thing I jump on to what General Cardone has said, I've always had a theory that when it comes to cyber permissions and cyber authorities, we've always suffered from the fact that cyber came from Stratcom. And Stratcom has always, because they're the nuclear guys, has always had a very highly procedural, mechanical way of looking at permissions. And I've always felt that's an intellectual artifact of that, and that has unnecessarily hampered our ability to gain permissions in real time in the cyber domain. Just my theory. Others could agree or disagree, but I think there's an artifact of thought there that has hampered our ability to break free of that shell.
I'll add 2 parts to that.
Go right ahead,
Not
General.
only that.
Go right ahead, General.
You run into the classification issue, rapid when you do this. And then we have this, and maybe General Barrett, if you want to take this, intel loss gain problem, which I'll just use the way the discussions I would have with the teams with Ares. It goes something like this. They go, but if we do that, they will know it was us. And I would say, when I was a brigade commander in Iraq and we're using artillery, killing these insurgents, who do you think was firing it? It was us. So does it really matter? I mean, they know we have, CENTCOM has operations in there. We're actually doing this in conjunction with the Iraqis. So why is it that we have to protect that we're doing this in cyber? This is a very hard thing to grasp, but then you have the intel loss gain, which goes into this. But if you do that, then we'll lose our access. Then we can't tell you what's going on, to which an operational commander like me says, well, let's get some more access, right? Why are we pinned to this one access and constrains all of our operations? So this is, I'll leave it if you want to jump on that, but it is, no, this is actually a hard problem.
It is, and I think you and I were briefly talking about this in the green room. So when I'm talking to the team about whether or not, whether we're in the SIGDev portion of generating effect or target development, or we're actually talking about the execution piece, and we're going to be talking to the COCOM about our recommendation. I'm going to keep coming back to what is the effect we're trying to have, what is the outcome we're trying to achieve. That very quickly gets you to solving the intel gain loss question. And sometimes we'll have something that is pretty clear. Hey, we are doing this for force protection. That can drive some decisions in very quickly with commanders. We might be doing it for another reason, in which case we might pause. And so I think the conversation is advancing. It's not necessarily as easy as we'd like it to be, but it is probably better than it was when I was working JTF Ares with you.
Okay, thank you very much. That's excellent. I'm going to go back to Lieutenant General, but you know, our topic here is multi-domain operations, so I am going to focus on that for just a second, okay? General Barrett, our cyber represents a command that's a globally engaged today and is actively maturing multi-domain operation concepts. Can you speak a little to your general approach and vision on how we do this?
I think the main thing is you're not going to be doing these type of effects for their own sake. You don't do cyber just for the sake of cyber. You are trying to have either a deterrent effect, a coercive effect, you're messaging somehow, you're looking to de-escalate, and so there is a reason why you're going to do either an information operation, electronic warfare, cyber operation. It doesn't make a difference that it's a non-kinetic type of capability. So what is it that you are trying to achieve? If we are actually in crisis and conflict and there is kinetic operations, this does need to be integrated with the schema maneuver. It isn't a standalone thing that you fire off. It should be, and when we were really early in executing these types of cyber operations back under JTF Ares, I would say probably early on, we were not integrated with the schema maneuver, but as we progressed in our maturity, we found that there was much greater effect that we had when we were integrated with the kinetic operations. Whether it was executing before the kinetic operations or after, or amplification of the operations, whatever it was that we were doing, when it was deliberately planned as part of the overall operation, it was much better. And I think that has really carried through our ethos in terms of how we would use these types of capabilities. So this idea of just always combining really pervades my thoughts in terms of operations in the information environment and multi-domain operations.
All right, before I open it up for a little dialogue, I did want to go to General McKenzie. The current state of our U.S. ground forces. Sir, given these takeaways that General Barrett's talking about, do you feel the U.S. forces are adequately prepared for conflict and resilient to the impact from adversary activities in the information dimension?
So I am actually more concerned about our ability to deploy the force forward than I am about our ability to function on the battlefield. I think My companions up here have discussed some very good initiatives that are underway. I think that over the past decades, though, our potential adversaries, particularly China, has studied the way we deploy. It's an away game from us, for us. We've got to leave the United States and go to where we're going to fight. And I think that is a unique vulnerability because most of that is done over unclassified systems without the protections of many of the things that the tactical forces have. And so I think that is a unique vulnerability. And I think we're certainly doing a lot of things to improve that weakness. But as a combatant commander, I worried more about that than I did what was actually going on in the theater.
You know, I'm going to jump on and ask General Cardone to comment on it too. We'd asked him earlier about competition phase, and one of the theories that we see is a lot of the influence or potential impact on our ability to deploy will actually occur during the competition phase. So, General Cardone, you got any additional thoughts on these subjects, or not to put you on the spot, but I know we've had several heart-to-hearts on this.
Well, I might open up a little bit more on, so I 100% agree that, with General McKenzie, that we're rather predictable in the way we deploy, and we depend a lot on commercial carriers. And that creates its own vulnerabilities. I think where this is going to get more complicated is, you know, a year ago this month, large language models, i.e. generative AI, emerged in a big way. And what that's doing to the ability to put together, you know, different deployment opportunities, et cetera, what that's going to do, because now you can start asking, if you have the right data, and a lot of this data is commercial. I mean, ports are ports, airfields are airfields. That's all available. You can start running simulations pretty fast. And when you start thinking about, in addition to that, with the AI implications on what's going to happen in cybersecurity and in information operations, this is a significant issue that's like a year old in the public's eye, maybe a little older, but when you look at the rapid development of large language models, I mean, just the hyperscalers, I think from November to April last year, 13 new large language models by small companies like Facebook, Microsoft, Salesforce, Amazon. They released 13 in just that amount of time, and I don't know how many's been done since then. So, and we should not pretend that our adversaries aren't looking at this. Mm-hmm. It's not like they're locked up, and you know. So, I think that as we go forward in this is going to become a much more serious problem than it is today. Not just because of the predictability, but because of the way that this operates across the cyber electromagnetic spectrum.
I think this is the transparency piece, that the AI piece and the ability to see some of this data, whether it's commercially purchased data, acquired, however, it just really emphasizes this fact that we're dealing with a very transparent deployment and battlefield that we have to contend with as part of our operations.
Okay, I got another one for y'all. You know, again, focusing on where we're at today, look at where we're at. We're sitting, I think General Cardone said it, we're sitting in the middle of the largest training, education, and simulation conference in the world. What are some of the priorities we need to focus on to better prepare us for multi-domain operational challenges? General Barrett, I'd like to start with you on that.
I'm going to start by recruiting some of the high school students that built those fabulous robots. And if I could bottle some of their energy, it is better than caffeine. That's where I'm going to start with, Brad. The one thing that I'd really like to see is just, and General Cardone hit on it, more realism in our exercises, in our training, at echelon, and for some of these things like data, AI, ML applications, cyber, the information environment, information operations, more realism. And And I don't want to leave it there. There's a piece of effectiveness there that if I can measure the effectiveness of the training as well, it is not just sufficient. I brief numerous general officer training forums from Army curriculum to Joint Force Land Component Commander course. And I do wonder, what is retained from that presentation. I get the AAR comments back. It was great. You expanded my understanding of this, but I actually don't know how effective my 1 hour class is going to be in terms of you being able to better integrate these types of capabilities or make trade-off decisions on IGL, or maybe I should no longer do collection with TLIS, and now it's time to go to electronic attack. And you're making those trade-offs as part of your decision-making process. We really need to exercise those with our leadership. Over.
All right, I'm gonna let the other two, y'all jump on that if y'all want to before I move on.
Hey, so actually, I'll take a slightly different take on this. I want to talk a little bit about simulation, campaign simulation, and wargaming, because I emphasize that as one of my very highest priorities when I was the Central Command commander. Part of it came from my prior life. Before I became CENTCOM, I was the director of the Joint Staff and had the opportunity to observe very, very high-quality wargaming work done up on the Joint Staff level. We wargamed a lot of things. And then before that, I was the J5 on the Joint Staff. So I've been exposed to it at a very high level of sophistication and ability. And when I came down to Central Command, I also brought a little personal baggage. I'm a big war gamer. I've collected war games for over 40 years. Going back to the early 1980s, I have an embarrassingly large collection of combat simulation games. So it's always been an area of interest for me. But as a commander, what I wanted to do was, if I looked at a plan, and I had the opportunity in deliberate planning to do this, I wanted to ensure we simulated that plan, that we looked at it, and that we ran as many variants as we could, so that when I went up and argued bureaucratically inside the Department of Defense for resources for my plan, I could pull out quantifiable data. What you always seek to do as a commander, particularly as a theater commander, is reduce the qualitative judgment to as small a part of the total problem as you can. And you do that by looking at campaign modeling, looking at, here's our plan, here's how it does. And I'll give you an example, without being classified. One of the core problems CENTCOM has, if you're going to fight a war with Iran, is the relative exchange rate between our ability to destroy Iranian mobile missile systems and their ability to disrupt our airfields across the region. That's very gameable. You got smart people, OR folks, that can look at that. You can tinker with the variables, and you can look at all kinds of data and get all kinds of output. The problem the commander has, though, when you do this kind of work is, many times up on the Joint Staff, we'd run a war game, and I'd come out of that, and I think, Jesus, what did we just look at? Because the answer was so complex that it wasn't usable for a commander. In fact, it was OR, operations research guys and gals, talking to other OR guys and gals. And that, while interesting, is not going to solve anybody's problems. It needs to be something that's usable by the commander. So we spent a lot of time and resources at Central Command in looking at simulations and games as a way to reduce, enlarge the quantitative information that can inform a commander's decision, and reduce the judgment, reduce that qualitative thing to as small a part of the problem as you can. And I think what we're seeing now in large-scale gaming and simulation leads directly to that. It's an exciting time. I actually regret I'm not at CENTCOM anymore, because I'd be jumping all over that if I were there. So the work you do here is very important, and it feeds directly into that. So as a consumer of that, an aggressive consumer of that, I'm a huge supporter as well.
I 100% agree. So I'll back up. So first, I absolutely agree with General Barrett. The first key is people. And we talked about there's different ways to do that. Then right behind that is the training, right? And how can we do that better? And then that leads you directly to war games and simulations. but we also have to make sure we run those war games and simulations with the right kind of imagination and curiosity. And I say that because if you go back and you look at these, obviously you can tell I've been involved a little bit with AI since I've been out, right? But when you look at Go and AlphaGo, when you look at those games, and you look when they were playing the world-class players, what really stumped those players was the game did something completely unexpected. Like it violated the rules, much like General McKinsey talked about with Hamas in the beginning. It violated the rules. There's another one with poker. I like the poker one because it's a lot like war, right? You have to play a series of hands to win a game. You deliberately are deceptive. You have all kinds of hidden cards. That AI was trained on synthetic data. That AI also did the same thing, broke all kinds of rules that were common with the world-class poker players. By the way, which they all said, we'll crush this AI. Well, they all got crushed, okay, and modified their play as a result, which is where I'm really headed, which is what General McKinsey talked about, which is more simulations, more wargaming, not only reduces the risk, but ups our game. So now we're better prepared to go forward, because I believe in the end, all this technology we're talking about, it's all going to change, right? It's democratized. It's global. Like, it's going to be very rare. We're going to keep something so secret. Once we expose it, especially in cyber, it's known. And then it's going to be weaponized immediately. So how do we win in that? People, training.
Okay, I'm going to stay on this thing just a little bit, but I'm going to go back to something we talked about this morning, okay? And you really intrigued me by this, and I'm going to ask you to expand a little bit on it. From your experience in your current work, what challenges do you foresee preparing Army and Joint leaders for the complexity of today's environment? And I'm going to start with General Cardone.
I knew you were going to do that. I'm probably going to overstate this, but one of the challenges that I think that we are still coming to grips with is, my time from colonel to lieutenant general was all involved in this. We're talking basically 2001 to 2016. It's all a different kind of war. That's not bad. That's all fine, with the exception of my time being a division commander in Korea, which was very different. But a lot of our talent now that are where I was, that's the frame that they approach things by. Not all of them. I'm overstating this. But when you look at things through that frame and then you're facing a different model, you have cyber, you have speed, you have transparency, you have the things General McKinsey talked about. It's our ability to adapt. And that is challenging because a lot of those young captains, even lieutenants that are now colonels, brigadier generals, they went through Syrian experiences. And when you go through Syrian experience, it really frames you. And it's very easy to stay latched onto that and not see it for what it is. And so for me, a lot of this is about imagination, curiosity, and how do you do that? This conference goes right at it. It's games, it's simulations, it's war games, it's this type of thing that through repetition, through the right kind of experiences, we can change that and bring it forward.
Okay. I got one more question I wanted to ask, and then I'm going to open it up and let the audience ask a few questions, and I do mean questions, not dialogue. But I do want to go back to General Barrett with one last question. There's a lot of lessons learned on how the information environment is affecting current battlefields and the support they receive on the global information exchange. How important is it to prepare your organization for these challenges? I'm going to start with you, General Barrett.
Very important. But I think there's a component of the battlefield. We'll go back to the Ukraine lessons learned, and I think this is one of the things that I think numerous outlets have kind of captured, and that is, you know, were the Russians able to gauge the Ukrainian will to fight? And so think about what that means in the information environment. They were able to have a resiliency against some of the messaging that, and it really befuddles me because Russia has such a mature approach to information operations in that area of the world, and yet they decided to go with a kinetic operation, and the Ukrainians were absolutely resilient to some of the messaging that was happening inside the Ukraine. And in fact, their will was able to overcome both kinetic and non-kinetic operations. I think about it also from the standpoint of our ability to deploy from CONUS without being distracted. The example that, you know, kind of just rings in my head is Colonial Pipeline. Do we remember what Colonial Pipeline looked like in the Southeast? What is your memory of it? Is it that we were incensed that we were attacked in the Southeast, or that we were highly inconvenienced by gas stations not having gas and pictures in the media of people filling up, you know, cans of gas? That type of event, I think that for me speaks to, if we do have something that is large scale against critical infrastructure, how would we react to it? And so the information environment becomes very important. I think also General McKenzie mentioned what's happening in Gaza. There's one day of what happened to the Israelis, and then everything after that has been what has been happening to people in Gaza. And you see that pendulum swing, and at the end, conflicts do come back to the strategic level and policymakers making decisions, and this has to play a part. It is a factor. And so even though we're talking about the battlefield, what does it mean to the soldier on the battlefield? It goes all the way back up to that policymaker making decisions about how they are going to, whether they're going to continue waging conflict. Over.
Okay, anything our other panelists would like to add to that? No? Okay. Well, I tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to open it up. We're going to give the panelists time to make final comments. But before I do that, I am going to open it up for a couple of questions. So do we have a microphone that we can, can we use this one? Test. Hold on. This one work? Test. Is it on? Hello?
It is.
Hold on 1 second. All right, while they're turning the mic on, again, we're going to open it up for questions. Oh gosh, we got a bunch of them here. Where do you want to start? Start over here and we'll.
Brad, you knew I'd ask a question.
I knew it.
No, thank you very much. It's been very insightful. General McKenzie, you mentioned STRATCOM and traditional thought with nuclear procedures and how cyber was birthed there, and we might be hampered by that. And there's also been a lot of discussion about wargaming and large-scale employment of cyber effects and information warfare. Are we now, or do you foresee the second lieutenant at the CTCs, or whether it's home station training, employing cyber effects or information as a combined arm, just like we did as an artillery or air, or is this more of a strategic effects?
So that's a great question, and it goes to the heart of joint training. So like if you're going to be a rifle platoon commander, you need to be a rifle platoon commander. And you may employ, probably now in my service, we have drones at the rifle platoon level. You have electronic warfare at the rifle platoon level. But I would not expect that lieutenant to spend a lot of time worrying about information warfare. I would expect him to spend a lot more time worrying about the sighting of his or her machine guns and how that platoon is going to be effective. So, but now, that's an infantry guy. If you're in another MOS, where you might actually be doing that as your primary job. But in combat units, I would expect combat officers to be more directly focused on that. But the captain's going to be a lot more interested. The company commander is going to be a lot more interested in it. The battalion commander is going to be fascinated by it as you go up. So I think it's something that you see increasingly at the small unit level because it's out there, it's for real. We see it in the use of drones in Ukraine. I'm sure the Israelis are doing all kinds of things with robotics and other things as they go into Gaza. So yes, it's there, but I think you still need to master the fundamental skills of your profession, of which that is one, but probably at the second lieutenant level in a combat unit, not the primary one. I'm speaking as an infantryman there.
Any other thoughts?
I think it varies by what I would just want to build on what General McKenzie was talking about. So EW, absolutely, right? But first at the infantry level, but if they have EW capability, they'll use it just like every other capability. They'll figure out how to integrate it. But like a cyber capability, I probably see that at a higher level. Information, probably even higher, except in one respect. What they do, don't do, what they say, don't say, has an information effect on the battlefield. And that has to be ingrained in every leader going forward because, some of the worst things that happened to us information-wise were done at a very low level that took enormous amounts of energy at higher levels to undo. I shouldn't say undo, manage, which is the best we can do at that level.
Yeah, for our expeditionary SEMA teams, we have them at the no lower than core right now just because of the expertise required to plan and employ them. I think it would be too much at lower levels at this point, at least in the near term.
Okay, I think the next one's right over here. Yes, sir.
Yes, Marcus Prince from Northrop Grumman. General McKenzie, you talked about kind of the current place we are is that we sort of have, when it comes to the cyber domain, we have a glass jaw. So we could possibly be quite offensive, but maybe we have some issues on the defensive side, possibly. Where do you see industry helping you and helping the joint force solve some of those problems? Because, of course, you got companies like Facebook and AWS and everything like that, global companies, but there may be in the defense sector industry that we could help and how we would help.
Yeah, so actually in the job I do now over at the University of South Florida, the Florida Center for Cybersecurity, Cyber Florida, we're all defense there. There's no offensive capability in that organization. But I spend a lot more time thinking about that than I have in the past. And it's a great question. But here's the thing: if you're going to partner with industry, you've got to make it worthwhile for industry. You've got to develop long-term relationships, and industry's got to be able to sustain themselves, not for 6 months, but for 6 years or for 10 or 15 years. And in all our defense industry efforts over the last 20 or 30 years, a lot of that has bled away because of our inability to actually state what we want done and to promise that there's going to be a long-term future with that. So I would say if I were looking at it, yes, I believe that many of the solutions that we seek are outside the Department of Defense, which is, again, different than it was a half century ago, where most of the solutions we sought to problems, technical solutions, could be found within the Department of Defense, within defense-funded entities. Now it's off the shelf and it's outside, and that requires a different thought. But if you're going to do that, you have to recognize that you're dealing with a partner who actually has to make a profit on that, and you have to be able to promise that it's going to be around for a while. So, long answer to your problem, but that's the way I would. If I were trying to do that right now, I do believe there's a role for industry, maybe even a very high-level role for industry there, but you got to make it attractive to them.
Any other thoughts? And I hope, General Cardone, because I know you've been working in some of these, you've got some ideas of like AI and others, hint, that could help in this area?
Well, the good news is, I think, from when I first started in Army Cyber in 2013 to where we are today, we're a lot harder. That said, there's still a long way to go. I mean, it's one thing to be hard in the Department of Defense. It's another thing to be hard in the United States of America, especially when a lot of our capabilities are commercial, right? So We can, go to school a little bit. General Barrett laid out a number of things that the Ukraine did. Now, it started in 2014 when they took their first attack on black energy against their energy grid. And, but when you look at what's possible, you can see that. I do think that a lot of the problems, every time we solve one class of problems, new ones emerge. This is my point. It's always dynamic space. It will always be dynamic space. The hardware will evolve at the speed of hardware, software at the speed of our imagination, how humans put it all together, yet another level of complexity. So, but simple things like doing a lot of simple things, even so basic as two-factor authentication, which is super basic, right? But just moving stuff to the cloud, but also, actually General Barrett and Brad and I had this conversation. Start with the data. Cyber a lot of times is around data. We don't spend a lot of time on the data, we spend a lot of time on our network. Well, how about if we start locking down the data that's most important, right? And figuring out what that is, what are the access controls, how are we going to assess risk against it, and there's a whole evolution. So I think there's a lot of, I used to call it work factor analysis. If you had $1 million, where would you invest your money to have a much more secure network and data security? Where would you invest? And I actually tried to get that as a DARPA project, but I failed. But my point is that is, I think, how we should, it's a prioritization thing. What gives you the biggest bang for the buck to secure your data and the network upon which that data will ride?
Okay. I think we have a question over here.
Yes, thank you. I manage a team that delivers DCO analyst training for our cyber. And a hot topic with my team members is generative AI. How are we, how can we use it effectively to develop more realistic training? And then just generally, how can it be used, bring it to the fight? If we're going to do this, our adversaries are going to do this, right? They're going to use generative AI. So what challenges, on your comments about democratization of the technology and the speed of evolution and so on, what do you see the challenges are for us in combating, our adversaries using generative AI to defeat what we're using, to fight them, and how can we address those? Tough question.
And then there was world hunger.
Yeah.
One of the biggest challenges we're going to have with employing these capabilities is there just aren't enough people who understand them. And we, even within our own workforce, as talented as some of the folks are, I had somebody who went and attended some additional professional development training on AI. And he came back and he said, wow, I thought I understood a number of these models, but they presented 35 different models in the class. And, and this is a person that I have a lot of respect for, and walking away going, there's a lot there. And I do think this is going to be a generational problem. I don't think I can get my workforce, per se, up to speed on 35 models. So this application piece of it, I think, is going to be something that we're going to have to really be thoughtful about how we think through that. There is some energy being put behind how we're not only we can't just upskill the workforce to do this. There's going to have to be a strategy, and we have the AI center, but I think we're going to have to be a lot more deliberate in terms of the outcomes that we want it to deliver and employ while we're also getting our arms around building the workforce of the future in this space. We need to keep tracking what our adversaries are doing in terms of the AI space and be cognizant of that and how it may change how we provide solutions to the warfighter and how we defend against it. There's just think that it's incumbent upon us to do that, whether we use AI or not, to get after it. I think the other thing that comes to mind is, look, we don't have to wait until this happens. There are applications for AI that will make some of the routine things that we do much more simple. We're pursuing a number of initiatives through the Arctic that we run out of Army Cyber, looking for whether it's AI for continuous monitoring, or it's also, perhaps we can use it for language translation. Again, taking some of the routine things that we're doing and making those easier to preserve the expertise that our folks have to apply to really the more complex problems. Sure.
Maybe just a few thoughts. So first off, one of the reasons that generative AI is a problem is everyone in this room can use it. You don't have to have any training. You just got to be able to type in a prompt, right? The challenge is it deterministic? Do you have access controls? Does it leak data on the internet? Is it hallucinating? How do you know? How do you ask the right questions? So how do you build the controls around the use? That's the first thing. Are we going to use it? Of course we're going to use it. I mean, first off, on the outside, this is on fire, right? Department's moving fairly slow. A lot of organizations are moving slow. I mean, Samsung started letting their employees use it. They had a huge, massive leak of data because they didn't realize how the language models worked. And so there's a fast part of this, which is how do we figure out how to use it when it is? And then there's the other parts, like how do we actually apply this, my words, to warfare? How do we apply it on the defense? How do we apply it on the offense? And then we got to start thinking about that. And a lot of this expertise may actually reside right now in the commercial space, right? Not in the Department of Defense. In pockets, it's in the department, I'm sure. But the work going on the outside is really something. And you're going to see solutions to the problems already emerging, like separating the memory from the brain, right? And meaning the models are trained, but they only have access to certain data. And you're already starting to see this emerge inside the intelligence space, right? And then you can put all the right controls and everything. I think just realize this could be really fast-moving space, and it's going to stay like that for a while. And so, we as leaders have to just do our best to stay up and, to me, ask the right questions and understand the risk. In the companies I work with, I talk a lot about the risk. It's reputational risk, it's data risk, it's model risk, and it's an easy simulation. You start with this. When something goes wrong, who's at fault? Just ask that question. I can tell you who's not at fault is the language model, okay? You turned it on, you used it or something, but that's what people want to default to, and this is a big problem with autonomy as well, by the way, is who has the risk. And once that's sorted out, I think you'll see this move a lot better.
Okay, we got time for one more question, and then we're going to give our panelists a chance to have closing comments. They get the last shot, but one more?
Well, I guess that puts a lot of pressure on me to come up with a good question. But I wanted to pick up on the themes of information environment, and General Barrett's great example with the Ukraine-Russia conflict, where from my perspective as a cyber operations officer, I look at Ukraine's ability to maneuver in the information environment to galvanize the will of the Ukrainian people, which was then able to offset Russia's strengths in its conventional warfighting capabilities early in the war. And you can partly attribute Ukraine's willpower with Russia's inability to ultimately maneuver in the information environment to its own advantages. So given that we are at Itsec, I would just be curious, what are the challenges or resource requirements you believe are needed for the U.S. to be able to maneuver or conduct military operations in the information environment, as well as it maneuvers in land, sea, and air?
I got stumped where you said you limited it to military operations. And I realize that is what we do. and we do it under military authorities. But this isn't just military operations. So I think that I'd probably start with that. I think we are maneuvering in the information environment. I don't necessarily feel like, sorry, I lost my train of thought. I just don't think that, I don't know, you want to save me on this one, Ed?
I think one of the challenges, the other part I picked up on is what the U.S., I don't think, like if you look like what could we have done to help with the Ukrainian? Well, actually, President Zelensky was critical to this, right? I mean, his messaging, his narrative, he knew exactly how to use the words in the right way, in the right construct. I talked to Garry Kasparov, the chess player, soon after that, and I told him how this, that the way he was able to link it back. He goes, it's linked all the way back to the Golden Horde, and I'm like, oh my gosh, he's all the way back in the 1300s. But he goes, the words he's using in his native language, they understand this. And so part of this is, how do you, I don't think we can do, in a lot of places, we can do it ourselves. Like those, when you talk a country like that, it has to be done by the country. This argues for like hunt forward, like our foreign area officers, all the work that even, General McKenzie did as the commander with what he did with all those countries inside the CENTCOM AOR, all that plays. What we can do is, I think, is just try to best understand the environment to provide the greatest number of options that the commander can use. And these options may not all reside in the military, but like knowing what the electronic environment looks like, knowing all the language challenges, knowing where those are at, all of this we had this problem, we went into Somalia, right? We didn't realize the difference with the accents initially, right? So it's understanding this type of environment could help us immensely in the execution, because we did all the work up front in competition and preparation. I'll stop there.
And be the first to get the truth out. I think there are a couple things. Why did Russia leave the information environment, the internet up and running? We won't know, but they did, and it allowed the Ukrainians to come in and give their messages, and confidence in the government, confidence in the military, and inspire the people. The other thing too is, as misinformation started to occur, you were also able to very quickly put that information, that misinformation down, and the speed at which you do that, so it doesn't, volumize, is really important. So I think it goes to your point that if you understand what is happening in the environment, where they are going to most likely operate to put out their messages, then it gives you a leg up on really countering what it is that occurs.
All right. Look, I want to thank y'all for being the panel. This has been a great panel, but we're not closing out yet. But what I do want to do is I want to give our panelists the last word. Let them give closing thoughts, things I may not have touched. And I'm going to start with General Cardone, work my way this way.
Well, thanks. I've spoken a lot. I want to go back to one thing that General McKenzie said. We need help with better simulations, better war games that reflect all these domains, including the cyber domain, in ways we can train from the lowest echelon of whatever domain you're talking about up to the strategic level. That is what's going to give us our competitive advantage, because a lot of that other stuff is all fungible. But that training, the dominance in training, I think is what gives us a huge competitive advantage, and you will have a critical role to do this. The department does not build simulations, does not build these war games. That all comes from commercial industry, from the defense industrial base, et cetera. And so you've heard a lot of ideas here, and then stay abreast of the emerging technologies that are going to be severely disruptive to this space. And one of those, of course, is generative AI. But it's not the only one. There's other technologies out there as well that could be disruptive. And then how does that get integrated at reasonable speed into the war games on which we could do it? And then to build on the last thing General Barrett said, it would be nice when we run these war games is to capture some analytics that we can actually try to determine, did we learn anything, right? Then one of the hardest things we still have today is to measure readiness. It's very hard. It's very subjective in my mind still for a variety of reasons. One of those reasons is we just don't have the instrumentation metrics in a high enough level of fidelity to be able to know. And there's this is a huge topic. It goes from psychology and psychiatry all the way down. But that is becoming more possible, right, with the advances in leadership, research, the advances in decision-making research, the advances in the way that people take in information, et cetera. If we could figure that out, that's also related to simulations, we will be unstoppable. So thanks, and I appreciate your time today.
I gave you my point of view today, but you could have just as easily had my triad partners, Dan Karbler from SMDC and John Braga from USASOC in here as we experiment with our unique capability pairing in order to achieve outcomes. You could have had a multi-domain task force commander here also giving their perspective. And I think this is really vital. I really appreciate you having me here today, but go seek them out as well, as they're doing incredible amount of experimentation and innovation and thinking about how to really offer more options to commanders for the different types of dilemmas that they may be faced with in non-traditional ways. And how that informs your work in the training and simulation area, I think you'll find really rewarding.
It was great to be here this afternoon. I'm going to close out with something just a little bit different. I want to talk about the battlefield of the future very briefly. We've described a lot of it, but here's the thing that as I look at the future, here's what I see. Cohesion and disruption are poised against each other, and the ability to disrupt is always more powerful than the ability to maintain coherence. And that is the central problem that we face. And that problem is only going to grow in the years ahead. The battlefield of the future is going to be very different from what we've seen over the last 20 years. We're still addicted to data. As a commander, from Lieutenant Colonel on, my command post grew increasingly larger. We grew increasingly dependent on drawing stuff off the satellites, the ability to pass large amounts of data. In the mid-1980s, when I was a captain training to fight the Russians on a nuclear battlefield, we routinely actually disconnected all our radios, wrapped them in tinfoil, put them in the baskets at the bottom of your tank so they wouldn't be hit by EMP. We've lost the ability to do that. Well, that's coming back. All that's coming back, and whether we want it to come back or not. And the way I express it when I talk to junior officers is I say I'm going to talk about a dying phrase, and I'm going to talk about a phrase that's coming back. Here's the dying phrase. It's the phrase, the golden hour. For most of my professional life, we have schemed to get a service member who's injured to critical care in 60 minutes. It's not going to be possible in the future. It's not going to be possible if we fight the Russians on a large scale, the Chinese, the North Koreans for sure, and possibly even the Iranians. The battlefield is not going to allow that to happen anymore. Our helicopters are not going to be able to fly unmolested. They're going to be hit by drones. They're going to be hit by electromagnetic attack, all of those things. At the same time, the battlefield we're going to lose the ability to communicate as we have become addicted to doing. What's the other thing that's coming back, the new phrase? It's a thing called ITI. Some of you may be familiar with it, immediate transient incapacitation. It's the amount of whole body radiation a soldier needs to receive in order to be unable to conduct a basic soldier task. That would mean in the 3,000 rim range, you can't pick up this microphone, you can't talk, you can't hold a rifle, you can't drive a tank. It may take you a month to die, but you're ineffective. In the mid-1980s, again, trained by the U.S. Army at the Armor School at Fort Knox, Kentucky, we had these whiz wheels where we would calculate how to gain ITI effects against the Russians. Well, we stopped doing that. The Russians haven't. We gave away all our tactical nuclear weapons. The Russians haven't given away theirs. They've got over 3,000. We got a couple hundred B-61 TAC-4 gravity-delivered devices. The Russians have got all kinds of novel systems. I just say this to paint a picture of the future. If we go to war, all the things we're talking about are going to be dependent on the passage of information at vast scale. All I know tells me that's not going to be possible. We're going to lose. We're going to be fighting a contested environment in space. Even if we don't have nuclear weapons on the battlefield, we're going to have nuclear effects on the battlefield. And by that I mean EMP effect. And that's the future that we're going toward. That's the future that the Chinese are looking at, that the Russians are looking at, and the North Koreans are looking at, and the Iranians to even a lesser degree. So it's a very dangerous future that we're looking at. The work you do here is going to be very, very valuable in helping us to address that problem. But we just need to remember that physical effects are going to make it very hard to do many of the things that we take for granted today. Thanks very much. It was a great afternoon.
Okay, before we close it out, first of all, personally, I want to thank y'all for the honor and privilege of being able to be your moderator today. It's been very enlightening, and I've very much enjoyed it. And on behalf of myself and Colonel Bates, we've got a little present for y'all. I shamelessly have some bourbon glasses with the TSMO logo, so y'all will remember us when you go home. Now, I got them bourbon glasses. It's y'all's job to fill it up, okay? So again, thank you very much. And I even got them in a wood case here, so thank you so much. I appreciate it. Thank you so much. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you again for taking your time. And sir, always a pleasure. Again, can we have a round of applause for our... Again, thank y'all, and I appreciate y'all's time.